we established the existence of the Hermetic wisdom from the ancient world. But we're at, about 200 AD, and Christianity comes into dominance. It becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 300s. And so Christians go from being a highly persecuted sect, suffering incredible persecutions under emperors like Diocletian, before him Nero, to, in a way, enjoying a position of privilege within the Roman Empire when Christianity became the official religion. Constantine established it. So we go from there through the fall of the actual Roman Empire in the West in 476 AD. But the empire lives on at Constantinople, which doesn't fall until 453 AD to the Ottoman Turks. It's about 1,000 years, isn't it? And this time Christianity is developing in its sacramental liturgy, in its theology, and in social organisation. Ideas movements like Hermeticism do not get a lot of airtime, but there are Hermetic currents that find their ways into what are described as heresies on the fringe of Christianity. There have been many heresies which the official church has had to combat, and some of them are Gnostic and dualistic. And this is another thread. So for Hermeticism to get a better look in, you have to wait until the Renaissance period. So this was around the time of the Council of Florence in the mid-1400s. It was a big church council to try and unite East and West after they underwent their schism. But ultimately it was unsuccessful, and the Eastern Empire was eclipsed by the rising power of Islam. But at this time, new ideas were coming into Europe. They were coming in from Greece, but they were also coming in from Jewish Kabbalists that had been expelled from Spain in the Reconquista under Ferdinand and Isabella. So some of the Kabbalists who study the Kabbalah with its central symbol of the Tree of Life, they came from Spain. Some of them went to Holland, but a lot of them went to Constantinople. And Kabbalah had a bit of a golden age at the end of the Middle Ages. And then there was a whole school for it developed in Safed, Palestine, under Isaac Luria in the 1400s, in this period. So it became known that there was a secret side, there was secret teachings which were somewhat occult already within Judaism. So those secret teachings, as well as the Greco-Egyptian secret teachings, which have come from the pagan world, kind of poked their heads up in places like Florence. Florence was really important in the Italian Renaissance. And Cosimo de Medici, he had a scholar.
Family.
Yeah, the Medici family, of course. Incredibly famous.
Absolutely.
As a family of bankers. They were a banking dynasty. They had great power in Florence, and they could put popes on the throne. In fact, one of the popes was a Medici, at least one. But they had a patronage over the arts and over cultural things. And when news of the Hermetica, the Corpus Hermeticum, and all that wisdom from Egypt came into Florence, Cosimo said to Marsilio Ficino, who was meant to be translating Plato's works from Greek into Latin, he said, drop that, and we have something that has even greater antiquity. Now, the Hermetic writings referenced very distant antiquity, even though in the distant antiquity they would have just had oral teachings, but the writings were later. They were later than Plato's writings, later than Pythagoras' writings. Plato and Pythagoras were getting traction, but Hermes seemed like this venerable figure who was in remote antiquity, and they just kept the legends going. So Cosimo was so impressed that he wanted to know what was in the Corpus Hermeticum, so he got Marsilio Ficino to translate it. Now, Ficino, as well as others like Pico della Mirandola during the Florentine Renaissance, they became what you might call Christian Kabbalists. They believed that there was an esoteric side to religion, a set of hidden teachings, and a set of, well, they believed in a perennial wisdom. They believed in what they called Prisca Theologia. Now, this meant that the Creator had put amongst all the peoples of the world some kind of primitive theology. And if you could somehow just get back between the formalities and the externalities of all the religions in the world, you know, their different names for God, their different practices and so on, there'd be a kind of esoteric core that was common to them all, like some sort of universal wisdom. This was the Prisca Theologia. It was also known as the perennial philosophy. And a lot of these Renaissance magi thought that it was very close, if not synonymous, with Hermeticism. Right? So, in other words, both the biblical tradition and the pagan tradition, in their esoteric dimension, seem to be pointing to the one thing. In one sense, you could call it Kabbalah. In another sense, you could call it the Hermetic wisdom. But it was all about a wisdom teaching that was somehow accessible to the sages and the rishis and the initiates and the most advanced people in all the cultures around the globe. The language in which it was couched was not as important as the fact that there was such an ageless wisdom. And so they started reviving it. And then it caught on in more northern countries in Europe, and they all had their magi. And we have people in the Renaissance that are associated with this occult path, people like Cornelius Agrippa, Enric Cornelius Agrippa, and John Dee, whom I mentioned as the astrologer counselor of Queen Elizabeth I in England. Then in the 1600s, you had a mysterious society appear called the Rosicrucians. They were mysterious in the sense that it was very hard to pinpoint some external organisation of them. But what did appear was a few manifestos that were meant to be written by people high up in their order. And it was another version of these secret teachings. And all of these things could be considered, and it should be considered, as part of occultism, because they're all working on the same basic principles of manifestation. But with the Rosicrucians, not only was it about personal transformation, but it was about social transformation, of creating some sort of social utopia. And that utopia was going to be very different from the way Europe looked in the Middle Ages. Their envisioning of utopia was more of a secular utopia. And people of all different paths and faith traditions existing alongside each other, but universal principles guiding society, and there would be some sort of universal brotherhood. Obviously, these ideas would be big in France about a century later, when the time came for the French Revolution. So you had the Rosicrucians who were carrying the torch of the occult path, and then you had the Freemasons emerging in the 1700s, where the Grand Lodge was established in England in 1717. And then it was practiced widely in Scotland, and then in the New World it came to America. They had secret rituals, and there were very strongly occult elements in Freemasonry. Freemasonry also had a very progressive social agenda. And we know that Freemasonry was enormously important in the foundation of the United States of America.
Very.
The first president, George Washington, was a Freemason. Benjamin Franklin, their great statesman.
They're all Freemasons.
Freemason.
All of them.
And lots of presidents have been, in fact, if you look into it. And the whole layout of Washington, D.C. is very Freemasonic in its design and its geometry and everything.
The Pentagon.
Yeah, the Pentagon, yeah. The symbolism is there.
The symbolism's all there, yeah.
And not only in America, but in France, there's this romanticisation of things Egyptian, and there are obelisks and so on, and obelisks being planted in different places and being aligned to places in Europe and to ancient Egypt as well. I mean, the Egyptian civilization was a bit of a closed book for mainstream culture until Napoleon's armies went in 1799 and in the wake of that, a fellow by the name of Champollion cracked the Rosetta Stone, because how do you read the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt? There was this stone called the Rosetta Stone that had writing in hieroglyphs and then writing in Demotic Greek and another language. So using knowledge of Greek, etc., they were able to work out what the hieroglyphs meant. And so more and more interest in ancient Egypt was developing.
What an amazing place ancient Egypt was.
Yeah, so
compared to what it is now.
Well, it's still all there in the pyramids and so on, I suppose you could say, and in their relics.
They don't have the glory anymore.
No. Every empires come and go.
That's right.
But occultism was a big part of the rapid growth of the British Empire, and it took Freemasonry wherever it went, including into the New World. Now, in the 19th century, there was a French Occult Revival. Well, it sort of began around the time of the French Revolution. And it manifested in a whole lot of interesting ways. There was a fellow by the name of de Gebelin, who redefined the tarot cards. See, initially tarot cards were just playing cards. They developed in the 1400s in Milan, in Renaissance Italy, and they were very ornamental, beautifully designed cards, but they were used for playing games, like the card games we play today. And they didn't carry with them any other symbolism or meaning. But then, in the late 18th century in France, de Gebelin had a eureka moment and said that these cards are meant to convey the Egyptian wisdom, the Hermetic wisdom. They were icons that the initiates of the ancient world, particularly the initiates in ancient Egypt, had to appreciate and meditate on, and they represented transformative processes that these candidates for the mysteries would go through. So there was an arcane wisdom that was then laden onto the humble tarot card. Before that, they were decorative, and they were utilitarian insofar as they were playing cards. And they were like our cards. Like in a normal deck, you'd have 52 cards, but...
Works of art.
Yeah. Works of art showing, I mean, to the normal pip cards, so-called, like the numbered cards and the court cards, and there's an extra court card in the tarot deck than there are in a normal deck of cards that we'd have today. But they also developed what were called the trumps. A set of 22 cards that depicted scenes from medieval life and important figures like Death, the Grim Reaper, or the lightning-struck tower, or the Hierophant. It was also called the Pope, so the Pope was a big figure, and so was the Emperor. There's a card for the Emperor. And even there, these trump cards, or triumph cards, were just extra embellishments of the tarot deck, depicting scenes from medieval life in Christian Europe. But in France, tarot was turned into a different kind of vehicle. It became not only a vehicle for the Hermetic wisdom, but then it also got laden with Kabbalistic correspondences and symbolisms. There was one of the most famous occultists, really of all time, but certainly stood out in the 19th century, was a guy called Eliphas Levi. He wrote important works like Transcendental Magic. He was actually a Catholic priest, but he was also a ceremonial magician, and he was learned in Hebrew. And he explained that the tarot deck was a visual representation of the Kabbalistic tree of life. So now you have the Kabbalah and Hermeticism overlaid on the tarot. So tarot is a kind of art form that is also used as a divinatory tool, because most people associate tarot with fortune telling or the reading of the cards. That came later, and of course everything gets mongrelized and degraded and distorted and sensationalized, just as the true star knowledge gets degraded and sensationalized in, let's say, astrology columns in the newspaper, so too the tarot as a divinatory tool, but also as a symbol, a deck of archetypal symbols. There's a lot of rubbish spoken about it, so it's better to go to the more traditional sources if you want to understand what it meant for the people at the time and what it means for practicing occultists today. And then you've got very important developments going on in the latter part of the 19th century on this occult path. And one of them was the foundation of the Theosophical Society by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, usually known as Madame Blavatsky, and Henry Steele Olcott. Started in New York, and then it shifted its headquarters to India, and it played a huge political role, incidentally, in the gaining of independence for India and Ceylon, which is what Sri Lanka was known as in those days. Henry Steele Olcott is celebrated as a national hero over there, and Blavatsky too. He's the only Westerner that's ever appeared on postage stamps in Sri Lanka. So these people were they were maintaining that there was a secret doctrine, but it was the esoteric core of all religions, and it was, mightily there in esoteric Buddhism and esoteric Hinduism, and these religions, because of that core, need to be protected from Western colonial influences. So the Theosophical Society, in its political action, was a big protector and mobiliser of people on the Indian subcontinent against British colonialism. Gandhi owed a lot to the Theosophical Society. And after Blavatsky, one of its leading lights was a woman by the name of Annie Besant. And she was not only a brilliant writer and outstanding theosophist, she was also very active amongst the suffragettes in the women's movement, first wave feminism, and a big promoter of socialist causes. So what we noticed back in as early as 1614 with the Rosicrucians and the Illuminati, this coupling of, because they're another Bavarian group, the Illuminati, that, anyway, you can look them up if you want, but they were deeply psychological. And they took it's almost like they took the Catholic practice of the confessional and turned it around for their own use in terms of psychological probing and psychological programming and controlling of the people that are involved in the movement, because they knew that if you control the mind, you can control the culture. And there's certainly a descent from there to modern advertising and psychoanalysis and a whole lot of things.
How do you think they control us?
So what I'm trying to say is the Theosophical Society was showing these sort of utopian political ideals, just as the Rosicrucians were a few hundred years, 250 years to 300 years before them, and also the Freemasons. And then the Theosophical Society butted off the Anthroposophical Society under Rudolf Steiner, because he was originally with the Theosophists, and then he broke away and started his own movement in Europe, which was another powerful purveyor of the occult tradition he called it anthroposophy. And it had a more sort of Western, esoteric Christian flavour than the Theosophical Society. A lot of whose main works were, very laudatory and extolling of the Eastern paths. And, in Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, there's lots of Vedic and, Sanskrit terms and so on. It's largely couched in Eastern language. So her two main works were Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. She was a Russian noblewoman that actually claimed to fight alongside Garibaldi in the wars for Italian independence and the overturning of the Papal States in Italy. And she lived a fabled life of exotic adventures and explorations of different cultures and their secret traditions. And there was another figure who did this, and he was from the Caucasus Mountains, down in that sort of area of Georgia, around the Caucasus. His name was George Gurdjieff, and he had adventures with remarkable men, which was, I think, the title of a book that the main disciple, P.D. Ouspensky, wrote. And he set up esoteric schools to teach people about personal transformation. Like Steiner, he had a whole program, and he had like schools in Paris and elsewhere where you could take a person and through structured exercises change their consciousness, transform their consciousness, so they understood the things that the initiates in the mystery schools of the Mediterranean in the ancient world would have understood. And both Gurdjieff and Steiner were geniuses. They had omnivorous minds, and they really had something to say and contribute in a lot of areas. They both had systems of dance, for example. Right? In Steiner's case, it was called eurythmy, and they were using dance as a form of spiritual therapy and transformation. Steiner also developed the system of agriculture, biodynamic agriculture, and he had ideas about architecture and music and lots of things. He was a multifaceted genius. And then out of the anthroposophical movement came another figure who wrote a seminal work, but its authorship was attributed to Anonymous. It came out around the early 80s. It was called Meditations on the Tarot. But we know this figure was a Valentin Tomberg, who used to be with Steiner and then went out on his own. He's a very interesting figure, but we don't have time to go into him today. From the Theosophical Society in the, not the first wave, but subsequent generations, there was another woman called Alice Bailey who wrote a whole suite of books on a coming New Age.
She was amazing. And
the work of the masters, because from the beginning, the Theosophical movement kind of promoted this channeled literature.
She's no longer alive, is she?
No, she would have sort of flourished in about the 1920s, 1930s, but she left a lot of books, and they, from everything from esoteric astrology to esoteric psychology, everything was esoteric. And the plan that the masters had to usher in a new age and the role of the United Nations. So it was both about personal transformation and political transformation, and a new age coming. Yeah, she wrote this massive tome called a treatise on cosmic fire. And it just ranged through the whole solar system. And it talked about orders of life and orders of evolution that seemed like entirely speculative. But both she and Blavatsky claimed that they were telepathically receiving the thoughts of ascended masters or even masters who lived, in the Far East and could telepathically communicate with them.
They were geniuses, I think, too.
Yeah. But it wasn't sort of automatic writing, it was more a collaboration. Like Bailey and Blavatsky would have been conscious in writing what they did. In America at this time, the spiritualism was getting going and transmediums and so on. But part of the reason Blavatsky said she was sent to America was to try and kill off spiritualism and make people aware of deeper truths and profounder truths, because things with spiritualism they can be deeply deceptive, and they're outside a lot of the normal controls, because when a trans medium is not necessarily, they're not conscious usually of what's coming through them, and they're not responsible for what's coming through them. They may be attempting to communicate with the dead, but they're not. They've gone into a trance state, and
Do you
it's
think
the same.
You can communicate with the dead?
Why would you want to?
Oh, if the dead meant something to you,
I'll tell
there's
you.
a reason.
Well,
that's a reason.
Well, traditionally, the dead have always meant something to religious people, and they've always felt en rapport with the dead.
Yeah, but I'm talking about in your own personal life.
But do you see what's actually happened when Christianity broke up? When Christendom used to say masses for the dead, as you know, they believed in the souls of the dead in purgatory. They prayed for the dead. They believed in the communion of saints. It was one big church, and there was no mystery around death and the afterlife, in the sense that the church gave them a clear teaching about their relationship to these things. But when certain nations broke away and had their national churches, and they rejected, let's say, they broke from the unity of Christendom, and also rejected the ecclesiastical structure of the church, especially with the Pope at the top, the ecclesiastical hierarchy of bishops and priests, and the sacraments that the church was offering as channels of grace. Like Martin Luther, who began the Protestant Reformation, he talked about the priesthood of all believers. And it was like, we don't need an organised church, and we don't need a priest to mediate between God and man. It's interesting, isn't it? Because remember how I said that in the prophetic...
I felt that anyway, yeah.
A lot of people identify with what Luther says. But Luther was already pushing it in the occult direction by so saying, because he was getting rid of that critical mediator between God and man, which I said the prophetic traditions had to have. It was one of the hallmarks of the prophetic traditions. The priest, the prophet, and the king. Do you remember I was saying that? Mm-hmm. This is like, let's get rid of the priest, and we'll get rid of the king, which they did in the French Revolution, and the prophet. And so without even intending it, Luther was pushing spiritual practice more in the occult direction. And so things were set up for an explosion in the 20th century, which we call the New Age movement, which is spiritually very eclectic and also a kind of therapeutic spirituality. And we have to try and get our heads around that phenomenon, maybe next time. So we'll leave it at that for now.